Thank you, Meta. And thank you so much to Meta and all the people who've helped put together the Science for Peace lecture series. Meta was just laying out some of the different challenges the world faces. One of those challenges that I'm going to add to Meta's list, and actually people like Meta are confronting that challenge, are what William Blake, the great poet, once called the mind-forged manacles, meaning the limitations we put on our own consciousness, right? The ways we frame the world that limit our ability to act in the world. So that's going to be something I'm going to discuss today in the presentation. Now I'm going to begin, I like doing participatory lectures. So I'm going to begin the presentation with a question. And here's my question for you. What is your favorite book? Or what is one of your favorite books? Do you think that everyone should read that book? So how about this? Why don't we just take a minute, maybe introduce yourself to someone next to you or in front of you. Tell them what your favorite book is, or one of them, and to answer this question. Do you think everyone should read that book? Go ahead. Take a minute and do this.
Okay.
How about let's hear from a few of you. Let me hear from a few. This is always interesting to find out what are people's favorite books. What is your favorite book? How about someone, let me get a volunteer from the audience on this. If I don't get a volunteer, what I usually do when I teach is I just point. Yeah, go on, thank you.
My favorite book is my book.
Your own book, yes, that's great.
It's called Climate Change in the Nuclear Age.
That sounds like an important book to read, and I assume you want everyone to read that book.
They could start.
Yeah, excellent. Yes, go on. Is your favorite book your own book as well?
No. It's very hard, to select a book. But one that comes to mind for me is a book I read a couple of years ago by the well-known American social critic Neil Postman.
Yes.
And the title of the book is Technopoly.
Yes.
I would very strongly recommend that to anybody living in the 20th or 21st century.
Yes. He's a great helpful critic. Thank you. Yes, great suggestion. Yes, go on.
The books that occurred to me are very different. There are two.
Go on.
One is the Kalevala.
Uh-huh.
It's the oral tradition about the creation of the world of the Finns.
Fantastic.
I think it's fascinating. It's my people.
Uh-huh. Yes.
So, the other one that occurs to me immediately is 100 Años de Soledad. You work in Latin America?
Yes.
100 Years of Solitude.
Yes, a great book.
Garcia Marquez.
Yeah.
So those are the two that come to mind.
And do you think everyone should read them?
Garcia Marquez? I think so.
Yes.
I'm not sure about the Kalevala.
That's interesting, but this question is interesting. Good, very good. Anyone else? Yes, go on.
I took ones from college, and I apologize that they're all Western, white, male.
No need to apologize. Go on.
Well, Consolation of Philosophy by Boethius, 6th century. I like Praise of Folly by Erasmus.
Great book, yes.
And Montaigne's essays.
Yes.
And then I discovered poetry later on.
Yes.
So,
yes. Excellent. Yes. Very good. Anyone else?
I have a book which is not mine.
Go on, a book that's not yours.
Beyond Misinformation.
Beyond Misinformation? Okay. Good. Yeah, very good. Yes, go on.
A book called Socrates to Start by Levine. It's a college introduction book on
Philosophy.
philosophy.
Yeah, that sounds excellent. Yeah, very good. Okay, did you want to say something? Yeah, go on.
Yeah. I wouldn't say it's my favorite book, but it's had huge influence on me over the years, and I would recommend it. And that's Hobbes' Leviathan.
Yes.
I think that's just
A great book. Yes. Often seen as the greatest English political theorist. Yeah, very good. Okay, excellent. Okay, well, let me begin my my presentation. My presentation, should I pause or can I start? Okay, so let me begin my presentation. The presentation is going to look at the second question I asked you. Are there books that everyone should read? That's the question that I'm going to try to work with here. Now, when we reflect, I'm really interested in this Science for Peace lecture series because, of course, it's one of the questions is how do we create global justice? How do we create a just, a fair globalization? How do we create a global civilization? And when we normally think of this question, we think of the question in political and economic terms. What are the political policies that will lead to greater democratization? What are the economic policies that will lead to greater redistribution of resources, etc.? I'm going to look at it slightly differently. Same question, but slightly differently. I'm going to look at it from the point of view of culture. How do we think about culture if we want to create a global society, global justice, global civilization, so on? Okay, so let me begin. In the humanities, when we debate the text that a student should be required to read, we are making a decision about the future of culture and to some degree about the future of human nature. In the humanities, we tend to believe that the books that students explore will encourage certain qualities, certain elements of culture, of human nature to prevail over others. Thus, we have fairly fierce debates about the content of students' required reading. Now, for a very long period in the West, we believed that a student should be educated in the classics, the canon, the great books of the Western tradition. Students should read the prominent philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas, and others who have shaped our Western understanding of the structures and dynamics of civilization. And students should also read the great literature of the West, Sophocles, Dante, Goethe, Cervantes, and so on, who have most influenced our modes of aesthetic expression and interpretation. Now, during the 80s and 90s, there was a debate in the humanities, the canon wars, between the defenders of modern great books programs versus a critique of these programs. The defenders of the great books tradition focused on students learning about the Occident, about Occidental society and culture from the greatest minds of the West, while the critics emphasized diversity, identity, localism, the voices of those who had been marginalized, historically marginalized by Western elites. This war, this educational war, was eventually won by the critics, by the postmodern, feminist, multiculturalists. By the end of the 1990s, the defenders of the Western canon were in retreat, and cultural studies type programs were in ascent. Numerous ethnic, gender, sexuality type courses of study emerged in the 1980s and 90s, while great books programs closed. Now, I want to re-examine that debate between the critics and defenders of traditional great books programs. Let me begin with some personal context. For my undergraduate concentration, I had the privilege of studying in a great books program at Concordia University at the Liberal Arts College. This Bachelor of Arts degree in Western society and culture is one of 100 or so great books programs still existing in North America, Europe, and Asia. The Western version of a great books course of study was itself inspired by the medieval and Renaissance educational ideal of a liberal arts education, believed to be crucial to producing a well-rounded, free human being, a being who had the moral and intellectual preparation for social political life. The traditional belief was that an education for a citizen began with a liberal arts education. A liberal arts education transformed one's life and character, whereas the education of a slave was solely focused on teaching a technical set of skills, was solely focused on teaching an employment skill. The Liberal Arts College at Concordia consisted of a fixed set of courses on the history of philosophy, literature, art, music, and science. And as students, we like to joke that the program took us from Plato to NATO. Now, let me show you the curriculum here. So it was a 3-year program. We looked at the structures and dynamics of Western civilization, modes of expression and interpretation, history of art, history of music, the sciences and society, and then we looked at the 20th century. It was fantastic, very broad program. And then the books we read were incredible. Of course, at the time, you don't fully appreciate it, but years later, you really do. The Bible, Republic, Thucydides, Aristotle, etc. And then in terms of, and you know, on and on to the modern era. And then, of course, and then also the literature. Now, the program provided us with a substantial foundational education survey of Western society and culture. It trained one to become a citizen of the West. It also gave us the opportunity to build a community of friends with a common syllabus, a shared set of questions, and a collective project. And it's interesting because I've known these people now for 20 years, and we still have similar discussions. We believe that the great books provided models by which we could collectively reflect on the ethical dilemmas, the cultural conflicts, and the key philosophical questions that link humanity across time. Historically, this type of well-rounded education was highly valued and seen as crucial to producing a citizen of the West. The critique of the canon. Now, beginning in the 1980s, great books programs came under attack from several writers and artists. Activists. The Western canon was interpreted by many postmodern writers and activists as simply a collection of works by dead white European males. Why should we read them? This assessment was not surprising. It was understandable that historically marginalized groups, like women, like students whose heritage lay in Asia, Africa, Latin America, desired course content that provided them with insight into their contributions to Western and world history. Their critique of the Western canon came primarily from three directions. Let me show you here on the slide. Decolonization, the political struggles of the 1960s, and postmodernism. So let me go through them. First, decolonization. Decolonization, which took place throughout the 20th century, and especially the second half of the century, enabled numerous new nationalities to acquire statehood. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were roughly 60 countries officially in the world. By the end of the 20th century, there were 200. Anti-colonial movements produced new countries, new interpretations, and new agents. Decolonization moved Western Europe off the center of the world stage. Decolonization, the fight against imperialism, was the crucial struggle for most countries in the world in the 20th century. And this is something that we don't often really reflect on in the West. In the West, we generally believe that the two great political events of the 20th century were the defeat of the Nazis in World War II and the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the 20th century. Nazism and Stalinism were the two great threats that we in the West faced in the 20th century. But we believe this because, of course, they were the two greatest threats that we faced. Of course, for much of the planet, the great political crisis was not the struggle against Nazism or the Soviet Union, but in fact, the struggle against imperialism. The unraveling of European military domination also led to the unraveling of European cultural domination. The marginalized began to be perceived differently and importantly began to perceive themselves differently. So the first impetus for the questioning of the Western canon came from decolonization. The second cause was the political struggles of the 1960s in North America. These struggles undertook a similar process that had occurred against colonial Europe. US and Canadian history ever since has begun to be rewritten in light of the contributions of diverse marginalized groups. A few years ago, I remember I attended a talk by my friend Judy Rebick, great feminist activist here in Toronto. And Judy pointed out in the 1960s, if she went into a library and looked for a textbook on women, there were no textbooks on women. She couldn't find any on women. And this is just an amazing thing to think about. 50 years ago, so little attention was paid to half the population. This is an amazing transformation that we've seen. And so before the 1960s, women were not considered a significant object of study. And all that began to be changed because of the contestations of the 1960s. The political struggles of the time were also battles over truth. They forced social scientists and humanists to pursue research that would fill the huge gaps in our knowledge. Half of the population had not been studied with any great attention to their own subjectivity. So the second cause for the interrogation of great books programs was the protests of the 1960s, which called for greater inclusion of women, of course, as well as people of diverse descent. The third cause for the critique of the canon was the rise of postmodern theory in the universities. Postmodernism, emerging in the 1960s, essentially argued that social reality and knowledge of that reality were culturally constructed. Truth was bound by the culture and language from which it emerged. Their argument was that there was no absolute truth that stretched across human history and geography. Now, modern theory, meaning theory that substantially developed in the West from 1800 onwards, contended that we could discover the essence of human nature, of society, of the universe through scientific reasoning. And the essence that we could discover would be applicable to all cultures, all societies, all parts of the world. Now, prior to the moderns, the belief was that religion could unveil these truths for us. But from 1800 onwards, there is a concerted attempt to replace religious epistemology with a scientific one. And this scientific one, it was believed, would perform the same magic that religion had once performed. For example, modern thinkers believed, and still believe, that we can construct a theory of human development that can be applied to all countries. All countries that want to develop should follow the West, the modern choreography, the Western path, the historical sequence that produced our affluence. Now, the postmoderns, in contrast, argued there is no one truth, no one model of development, or no one epistemology that applies to all societies. Each culture is unique, and therefore each culture has its own distinctive path to follow. There is no universal template for all societies or individuals. So as you can imagine, the postmoderns were profoundly critical of Western great books programs. They asked, why should students read the great books? Why should all students read the same texts? Who gets to choose the texts? Who has the authority to define what constitutes a great book? In terms of the books themselves, they asked, what are the power relations within these books? Why are men always the heroes? Why are foreigners often the villain? Why are women always secondary? The postmoderns contended that the history of the West was imperial and patriarchal. The great books, they said, were the intellectual correlate of that history. Great books inscribed the rule of elite Western males in the imagination of students. The critics contended that great books programs assumed a universalism that was not accurate or even plausible. Humanity is too enormous, too diverse, too disparate to be defined by a series of texts from a group of privileged European writers. Students should be offered a variety of courses that give them the opportunity to study the multiplicity that exists within our world, not just Western male culture. So the postmodern theorists were the third cause of the critique of great books programs. Thus, decolonization, the protests of the 1960s, the rise of postmodernism, all combined to put great books programs on defense. Eventually, these programs were replaced with an assortment of cultural studies type programs. Now, against this criticism, there was, of course, a reaction. In the 80s and 90s, a number of books came out in defense of the Western canon. Two prominent ones were Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind and Harold Bloom's The Western Canon. And these books in general made three arguments. First, breadth before specialization. Two, aesthetics, not politics. And three, universalism versus particularism. First, breadth before specialization. The average student enters college or university having 2 to 4 years to discover themselves and the world that they live in before dedicating most of their time to work and professionalization. If they enter the workforce, then they will have little time to read books on the human condition. Most of their philosophical reflection past college or university will take place via popular culture or in a non-systematic way. Actually, right before the talk, I was talking to someone who was pointing out that, in fact, now that he's retired, he has time finally to begin to dedicate to great works. And it seems to be the pattern. Either before you get into the work world or when you leave the work world, then you have time. But during that time in the work world, your philosophical system, you have a little time to pour into philosophical investigation. So thus these years of college or university are crucial for the student's development. In fact, for many of us, our intellectual experiences between 18 and 25 substantially shape our thinking for the rest of our lives. The defenders of the Great Books programs claim that contemporary education is too specialized. Specialization creates fragmentation, partial understanding, and this partial understanding is not helpful to our students. A student will go into business never actually having read Adam Smith. I have business students. When I discuss Adam Smith with them, they don't know who Adam Smith is. A student will enter science without ever having read Sir Isaac Newton. A student will study counseling without ever having read Carl Jung or Sigmund Freud. A premature focus on a field prevents students from grasping knowledge in its historical complexity. Specialization prevents the development of critical judgment. It prevents the development of a broad view of society. The great thinkers are significant because they reconfigure every aspect of knowledge production. Each new thinker provides us with a new mode of interpretation. In fact, the great thinkers often make us rethink the canon. They ask us to reimagine the major texts of the past. For example, Michel Foucault is someone that most of us who have been to graduate school in the humanities have probably read. For many academics, he's substantially revised our understanding of philosophy, history, literature, and other disciplines. Therefore, every student should read him if they want to understand the contemporary era. Similarly, every student should study the influential figures of the past who have helped us reimagine truth, ethics, literature. So the first argument of the defenders was that students should initially cultivate their range of knowledge before they specialize. Second, aesthetics, not politics. The major texts, for example, the plays of William Shakespeare, were not chosen for political reasons because they foregrounded the role of European males, but for aesthetic reasons. The great books are great because they are the most original books in existence. Everyone should read him because he is one of the most eloquent authors of the English language and has influenced English writers and others ever since. Similarly, everyone should read Sophocles, not because European males should be valued above all others, but because he is one of the most compelling playwrights that has ever lived. His version of the Oedipus myth, the story of a man in search of his father's killer, and the discovery that he is the culprit, has haunted Western thought and, of course, the Western conception of the self. The eminent writers, because of their originality, encourage each student to develop their own creative individuality. There is no better way to teach students to be creative than to introduce them to history's most innovative writers. So the second defense was that the great thinkers were not chosen for political reasons, but because they advance human creativity. They advance our understanding of what constitutes the beautiful, or what constitutes the authentic. Third, universalism against particularism. The defenders of the canon of the great books saw their critics as being too focused on politics, as being too focused on micro-constituencies. The defenders of the canon argued that postmodernism, multiculturalism, created a balkanized situation where students end up just studying themselves. Asian students study Asian studies. LGBT students study LGBT studies. Female students study women's studies, etc. For the defenders, the goal of the great books was not to encourage students to study themselves, but instead to help students transcend their circumstances and see themselves as more than one particular identity. They believed that students should be taught to become citizens of the West, not just citizens of Germany, France, England, the US, or any other part of the world. Now, these defenses were thoughtful: breadth, aesthetics, universalism, but ultimately unsuccessful. The critics won the debate. By the end of the 1990s, great books programs were in retreat everywhere, and various types of cultural studies programs, as I said, Black studies, women's studies, etc., emerged. And we can see this, of course, if we look at any contemporary university course catalog. So here's my question for you. Which side do you agree with? The defenders of the great books programs, who believe in unity, learning a common tradition, learning to be a citizen of the West, confronting the great questions, learning from genius? or the critics of the great books programs who advocated diversity, learning your culture and marginalized cultures, confronting a variety of questions, deciding for yourself what constitutes genius. So with this, let's take a minute. Again, how about this? We'll pair up again. Pair up or get in a bigger group if you want. Just discuss this. Which side do you agree with? And try to choose one side or the other. Go ahead, take a minute and do that.
I cannot choose because I'm absolutely convinced that was not the rest. That was included. I incorporated some great accents, some great meanings, a little bit of personal or what have you. So, some poetry from Persia. Yeah, you know, it's simple. You know, it's I think
I mean, I'm.
not that simple. Diversify the radio. Diversify the radio.
I was in.
I didn't go to
I love the participatory part. You get interesting comments. Okay, maybe just take another 20 seconds to finish off here. Okay, how about, let's just, I love polls. I'm very much a child of our time. I love polling. So let's do a little poll. How many of you lean to the defender's side? Just put your hand up. 5.5. How many of you lean to the critic's side? Put your hand up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, close 7. Okay, it's pretty half and half, pretty much. Okay, very good. Does anyone want to?
Can we have a third option?
Not yet. No third option. Not yet. The privilege of the speaker. But the defenders. Does anyone want to explain why? Why do you lean that way? Anyone willing to give us your defense? Yeah.
Well, the great aesthetics, you know, the cultural value, there's a kind of a universalism at best.
Yes.
You know, they're not just defenders of a particular city-state in the West. I mean, there's a light into the universal. So you figured great books like Tolstoy's, War and Peace.
Yes.
For example, it belongs to the world.
Yes.
It should belong to the world.
It's a good place to start.
Yes.
A good place to begin, to get a good foundation, a good feeling.
Yes, but you lean to the other side, right?
I do.
Okay, why? Why do you lean to the other side?
Open to the other. I think it's important. The new influences, new concepts, it's important to keep the intellect open to always to new things, I think.
Yes.
Always an evolution.
Yes, there's a kind of openness and creativity on that with that. Yes, that's very good. Yeah, go on.
I mean, in response to that, in defense, of the great books tradition, when you talk about openness, I would say that you will find that precisely that openness is one of the virtues of the great books tradition. Shakespeare. We don't have time to go into all the details, but I would argue that the great Western tradition by no means inhibits openness or.
Maybe it gives you a language, someplace to start.
That's interesting. That's interesting. A language of universalism or of openness. That's interesting. Yeah, go on.
If we're talking unity and universalism, then the left side is limited to the West and to books. I mean, there are great questions there that are universal, but I'm boarding a plane to Asia for the 8th time tomorrow morning. So to me, this is limited. Where's world history? Where's world religions? Where's big history? Where's modes of thinking? Universal principles. Those are universal approaches. I mean, this is an attempt to understand a tradition using issues that are universal, but we have to be broader in our scope today.
Yes. Yeah, good. That's very good. That's interesting. Well said.
Great books of the East, that's the question.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, go on.
I think I like great books, but if you go to provide that, the list that was provided earlier, it's the wrong list. I mean, some should be out, or extracts should be taken out of those books, and other things introduced. Some of it even from the Western tradition. Why not Sappho? Why not Lesbia?
Yes. Yes. Very good. Okay, excellent. Good, very good. Okay, here, let me continue on to this. So the modern's defense of the canon, the Western canon, was thoughtful, but slightly rigid in its focus. As well, on the other side, while the criticism of Western great books programs was timely, it was also short-sighted. The critics did not realize that students need substantial intellectual traditions with which and against which they might formulate their own interpretations. Substantial traditions are ones that have been researched, interrogated, and rebelled against for hundreds and even thousands of years. This need for philosophical stability, for judgment, has become even more apparent in our era of impermanence and social media. These are some of the questions that I've been reflecting on as a lecturer at Harvard and as a professor here in Toronto. And building on these debates, I recently designed a course called Big Ideas, Great Thinkers, which I teach at Harvard in the summers, and a Global Great Books certificate program, which I teach and coordinate in the School of Liberal Arts here at George Brown College. So in this, in the Global Great Books syllabus, students receive the opportunity to read Plato and Aristotle, but also Sappho, Confucius, Buddha, the great Mayan text, the Popol Vuh. And I teach these texts from a perspective informed by numerous critiques. For example, we investigate how the texts construct gender roles and identities. Thus, I've learned from the critics of the canon how to teach the great books via a more thorough, thoughtful method. The goal is to provide my classroom with the first semester of a global canon, a global great books program, and thus building on the attempted universalism of past great books programs. This is the first step for students to becoming global citizens. In the ideal world, every student would receive a Global Great Books diploma or degree, enjoy the shared collective inquiry that comes with it before proceeding on to a diploma or degree that was more directly focused on professionalization. Whenever I've studied or taught the great books, I've seen enthusiastic students who feel that they are doing something fulfilling and worthwhile. They believe they are getting something from college or university that they cannot get anywhere else. The investigation of the world's major texts is not only an inherently rewarding experience, but it also cultivates long-term critical and creative capacity. These days, when we think of education, we often think of it in terms of innovation, employment, citizenship. All of these skills depend on learning how to learn. If students learn how to learn, they will possess greater competence in responding to economic, political, and cultural needs. So then how do we teach students to learn how to learn? I would say go back to the Global Great Books, the foundational texts that have been the key pedagogical tools throughout history for all of humanity. So in this presentation, I've tried to describe the debate that took place between the modern defenders of the Western canon and its postmodern critics. In some sense, it was a replication of the classic philosophical debate between the theorists of unity and the theorists of multiplicity. I've tried to point to a solution to that debate that combines some of the best of the two sides. That is, retaining a focus on great books, but expanding and diversifying that effort by choosing great thinkers from around the world and teaching them via a method that includes an analysis of difference and power. This enables us to retain the most productive element of each side of the debate, the universalism of the Western tradition and the affirmation of diversity from the postmodern tradition. How can we operationalize this? Well, let's require all students to begin their college or university education with a Global Great Books diploma or degree. Let's require all students to develop a cosmopolitan imagination. I'm going to stop there. Thanks for listening.
You got questions all over the audience, I'm sure.
Great. Yes, go on.
Well, I think one of the values, perhaps of the liberal arts education, is you learn, well, the example I gave is of Trump. Now, if I had a better grasp of, history of theater or, some of these Greek texts, I would spot this guy as a demagogue, it's a type.
Yes.
And you would learn that. And then when you run into this in the real world, workaday world, your intellectual training will equip you to spot this.
Yes.
This is a very, in a sense, your liberal arts education is extremely valuable.
Yes, as a way of being able to, what you're saying is, as a way of interpreting what's going, the public discourse, or interpreting politicians, interpreting the media, actually, being able to critically assess what's being said and whether it's true or not, depends a certain level of educational development. And the great books, you're right, they do encourage that. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, good.
There is one book that might help the gentleman. Now, I haven't read it in many, many years, a long time ago. But there's a book called Plutarch's Lives.
Yeah.
Where you would have a Greek and a Roman personality, and they would compare the two. And through that book, you would be able to figure out what character or personality they had in almost any instance.
Yes.
Plutarch's Lives.
Yes, yeah, that's interesting. Because it gives you, that's like kind of a history of great great political leaders.
Well, what he did was he took one great man in Greece and then his counterpart in Rome, and he into.
And it gave you a chance to understand some patterns, at least to see some patterns. Yes, yeah, very good. Yeah, excellent. Any question? Yeah, go on.
Actually, it's my friend. He was listening at home, and he said one comment earlier, like.
Did it come off clearly at home?
Yeah, so. I think in the beginning the sound, but then it came okay.
Okay,
right?
yeah.
It says, I guess who defines universalism? I mean, I don't know. If you want to expand on that a little.
Yes, no, you're right. That's the question, and it's interesting. If we were to say, okay, so if it would be interesting to see how a Chinese thinker would define universalism. If we said to a set of Chinese thinkers, construct a great books curriculum, a global great book curriculum, not just China has always had a great books tradition, of course. But if we asked them to construct a global great books curriculum, it'd be interesting to see which books of the West they would choose. And for certain, there would be differences. There's no doubt about it. But I suspect there'd also be a lot of overlap. Shakespeare's greatness isn't just limited to the English-speaking world. I mean, Shakespeare has been translated into numerous languages. Filmmakers from all over the world have done Shakespeare plays. So I think what's interesting is if we were to do this and encourage this kind of universal thinking, but from many angles, it'd be interesting to see where we're different and where we converge. And I suspect there'd be a lot of interesting convergences.
I was thinking of more in books that touch on political aspects of life, and political theories, and then I could see a great diversity. I mean, not even geographically, but depending on your perspective and so on. I mean, maybe the idea would be to read a range of a number of them, and then.
Well, can you give me an example? It's interesting what you're saying. Can you give an example of this?
Well, even like Adam Smith, or even economics, you know, when I was in school, and then later on, I mean, I look at some of those biases of
Yes.
those texts. Right?
Well, yes, that's a good point. Adam Smith is still important, obviously. If you have to understand Adam Smith to understand neoliberalism today, right?
Well,
But
it might be.
yeah, no, here. Just give me a second. Let me finish the point. But I think the thing is, what's interesting is when you teach from a global great books perspective, you're automatically, it's a survey type of teaching. You're giving students a lot of different perspectives. I never give my own opinion in class because it's almost implausible actually to give your own opinion in a class with so many great thinkers. But that's good for the student. At least they get a chance to engage a diversity of thinkers. I think one of the dangers is if we just do, supposing we say, let's create a syllabus of the thinkers who we think have delivered the truth. So then the syllabus inevitably ends up being a kind of conservative syllabus or a progressive syllabus. But then you're back in the problem again. And what you need is a type of a teaching and thinking that gives students access to both of the perspectives, right? Or the variety of perspectives. Yeah. So anyways, but I think the question's good and it's interesting. I remember once I gave this lecture at Harvard to a group of international students. And one of the students was from Thailand. And she asked, well, would a text from Thailand be on the list of global great books? And I thought that was a great question because yes, it would be if it was constructed in Thailand. Right? And I think it would be very important that every culture would construct its own version of global great books, not local great books, but global great books. So that allows them to bring in their own material that's important, their own foundational text, but also engage with other foundational texts. Yeah.
We have a question coming in from the internet.
Okay.
Stephen Monaco asks from Kansas City, Missouri, do you have a blog where we could read more about your work and programs?
You could email me and I could send you material. Okay. I don't have a blog. I used to, but I don't anymore. But I would happily, I think I put my, 1 second here. I've got my email is down on the bottom there. So yes.
Oh.
A very good person to read is Martin Puckner. He's just written a book called The Written World. And it's an interesting book on the great books idea. So that might be worth reading.
Repeat that, please.
Martin Puckner. It's a book called The Written World. He's also the general editor of the Norton Anthology of World Literature, which is a 6-volume set which attempts to get the great books from around the world. So I use a couple of those volumes for my courses. So I can give you his name. Should I type his name down? Would that help? Or, anyways, the Norton Anthology of World Literature. I mean, that's an excellent resource. Yeah. Yes, Afsoon, and then yourself. Yeah.
I have 2 questions. One is, what criteria did you use in designing your own list? And the second question is, what feedback have you gotten from students who've been in your program?
Yeah, what criteria? You know, it's interesting because, again, there's a historical criteria where it's a complicated question because, of course, we have a tradition. So we have certain agreements in the experts, say academics, have certain agreements. Yes, if you study political theory, you should study such and such thinkers. What's interesting is that every discipline develops its own canon. So even people who are against the great books, what's very interesting is if you look in the programs they believe in. So say, for example, you look at African American studies or gender studies. They construct their own canon. They immediately come up with the books that they think are the great books of their tradition. Right? So this is a very normal process. So it tends to be, I tend to go with what experts say have been the most influential books. So now this is important. I don't necessarily choose the books that I think are telling me the truth. I choose the books that have most shaped our history and the history of thought. So while I might not completely agree with Michel Foucault, great postmodern writer, I do think we should all read him because he very clearly has shaped the thought in our era. Right? So I tend to look, that's the criteria I use. Students have been very happy with this. I think what helps is that I don't give my own opinion and I give I provide them with a diversity of thinkers and always defend that thinker when I teach the course. So that way, so whether I teach Adam Smith or Karl Marx, I'll defend either one of them in the class. So that gives them a little more flexibility, I think. So they've been pretty affirmative about this. Yeah. What's interesting is the question they raise when I say, well, it would be great if we had a great books degree program. They agree with me on this. The question, of course, is how would they handle it in terms of tuition, time, and so on. That's the big change that has happened. What happened at the end of this debate, what's quite interesting is, so the critics won the debate, but 20 years later, of course, the winner wasn't either side. The winner has been the neoliberals, who basically have done this massive push to make education focus primarily on employment. Right? That's been the new winner of our time. Right? And so even now, students will agree on the value of studying this stuff, but they're not certain about the time and money it will take to do it because it's so expensive for them. Education has become so expensive. So, anyways, yeah. Yeah, go on.
Well, firstly, I must congratulate you for the breadth of vision that you provided. I think none of the lectures I heard previous to this had that breadth. And I believe in breadth. But I must say that these great books and all that, I think they should have been more popularized and educated. Mostly the West, I would say, Europeans, before they started colonization. I mean, it's too late. They have consumed so much of the planet already and produced so much of carbon dioxide, for example, or nuclear bombs, that we don't have the luxury of thinking of this now. Because carbon and uranium will not wait for your education. It will kick your ass as it has been for the last so many decades. And people are beginning to recognize that. We need to focus on changing the practices, the way we live. That's more important now. Of course, I wish this was there before, but even now it is not never too late kind of thing. But we have got to look at, as I say, the nature of carbon and uranium, which doesn't care about your education. It is going to respond in its own way, in its own physics and chemistry. And the physics and chemistry is threatening our survival. And if that's the case, this is a luxury today.
Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you on the passion that you have for this. And I agree, I don't disagree with you in terms of the importance of addressing these issues as quickly as possible. Actually, when I finished my undergrad, I worked for Greenpeace for a year. And it was one of the best experiences of my life, a fantastic experience. And so I agree with you. I think that's true. I think what I would add to that is what's the content and form of thinking that has brought us to this point?
Greed.
Well, that's it. And, okay, so greed. But what is it? For it's very interesting when a species sets out to destroy the conditions of its own existence. This is a very interesting situation in human history. I mean, it's not a logical sequence actually, but it's very interesting when a species makes this decision. So what's happened? Because I'm a big believer in education, not as the only, by the way, as the only solution. That's one solution. As I said at the beginning, there's culture, but there's also politics and economics, and you need all three. But what is it about our education, the way we train people, that has allowed us to come to this point? Right? It's an amazing question, and I think in that sense, the education needs to be transformed. And yes, you're right. If all of us read do global great books, that's not going to change the world tomorrow. It's not going to change the world in a hurry. But it will. But I think it has long-term impact. And I think we should always work as activists and intellectuals, not only in the short term, but also long term. We have to think of both. Because we've seen actually the problem of short-term solutions. We've seen where that goes. It doesn't solve things. You have to have solutions that think in terms of short-term and long-term. So I think, so this is a long-term solution. What's interesting now is that students are very open to it. The students, compared to 25 years ago, university students would, the majority of them, at least in my experience, would automatically assume that the Western tradition had more intrinsic value. Whereas today, the students seem to be intrinsically global, and they recognize the value of engaging different cultures. And even the fact of travel, as you're pointing out, just travel, the ease of travel has made us realize the importance of understanding the world and its diversity and complexity. So, so I think there's a value to a long-term strategy, not only a short-term strategy. But I'm not against the short-term strategy. I agree with you on the short-term.
The short-term will decide your existence. You know, a few centuries back you were right, but with nuclear age and climate change, where it is at, short-term will decide whether you will have time to.
But this one will have to. You and I will have to debate this afterwards, because you know I remember a friend of mine. She was studying in environmental studies.
I will debate you in Harvard if you like.
Absolutely. A friend of mine was studying environmental studies, and I remember her saying back in 1989, we've reached a point now, it's irreversible. It's irreversible, climate change. And so I don't think that's true, actually. Right? But that was the belief then. So I wouldn't get completely trapped by the present. I wouldn't let all the prognostications around the present, I wouldn't allow ourselves to be completely trapped by them. Yes, there's a problem, but at the same time, there are always solutions. There are remarkable solutions that are always emerging. And these solutions emerge out of nowhere. That's what's one of the great things about human history. It's unpredictable.
That's what I thought when Donald Trump got elected.
Well, we thought that when Barack Obama got elected too. So, I mean, I think let's, anyways, we'll debate that one later. Yeah, go on.
I was going to, responding to you, is that those great books, the old list, especially, is dealing with ethics.
Yeah.
It's dealing with ethics and morality. And I think that to face the issues of the contemporary world, we have to base ourselves on ethical principles and the analysis, of what is moral behavior.
Yes, and it's interesting with the great books, often they are foundational texts for their culture. They offer the culture a compass to interpret the world. For example, the Bible. Confucius in China, or Homer in the warrior culture of ancient Greece. What's interesting is today we don't have a foundational text. And so what happens is the foundational texts people look to are self-help books, because there is no one broad foundational text. And what's nice about the Great Books project is I notice with students, it starts to give them resources to think through ethical questions, right? And that's very important. Thoughtful resources, substantial resources that have been interrogated for hundreds of years. That's very important compared to the stuff they're normally going to. The normal lists they go onto online, people go onto the 7 ways of doing such and such, the 3 steps to doing such, this kind of stuff, right? So I think there's value there in giving them, I like how you framed it, resources for ethical development and ethical challenges, right? Yeah, thanks. Yeah, yourself.
I think your thrust into global expansion is important, but I think that there has to be a survey of initiatives in this direction of broadening education. And I think this is one example of broadening education. I think you have to look at the broader context of programs and initiatives in this area, because I think education is narrow and specialized. So that's one point. The second, great books by themselves are disconnected from each other. You have to integrate them into a historical and cultural and context of values and comparative values and principles. We always have to understand organizational frameworks, principles, integrative frameworks that connect things. So education is disconnected, and books by themselves won't do the trick. Second, the great books are too extensive too voluminous for a survey approach. What you need is abstracts of these great books. Putting them into cultural context will abstract them and connect them, you know, and so that they get their essence. And you can compare them across cultures too. So we're missing all these, I'm raising all these points, which I think have to be looked at in terms of these issues, and that you've actually, this is an interesting discussion because you raise a lot of issues.
Well, I appreciate your comments because you're raising all the
Other issues.
all the tangents that come out of this discussion. One thing, this might help, it answers one of the threads you raised here. One thing that's interesting is when you look, when we had the discussion with students around ancient Greece, ancient China, ancient India, because we read a number of texts from each culture. One of the things that's interesting is they ask similar questions across culture. There is that. There is something universal there, the universalism of questions. The answers are completely different, but the questions are similar.
Compare the similar questions would be even more interesting.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Compare 10 great books in terms of these questions.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. They're very, very interesting in that way. But I think that's happening now. We're starting to see the beginnings of people writing global history and global intellectual history. So we'll start to see areas, points where there's crisp convergence of different thinkers and so on. Yeah, but that's a great point. It's a very interesting point.
That's why your Great Thinkers course could incorporate these new developments.
Yes, no, absolutely.
That's a great forum for it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Yeah, there's an interesting story of Alexander the Great and his Macedonian generals conquering India and meeting a group of Indian philosophers. It's a very, very interesting encounter because they ask him, what are you doing? What's the point of all this? Right, as they're all dressed in their army gear. And Alexander the Great says, well, to explore the world, to unite it, to bring it all together. And one of the Indian philosophers, actually, I think this was written about in Plutarch's Lives, by the way. One of the Indian philosophers picks up a piece of dust and just goes like this. That's what it'll all amount to. And it's a very interesting moment, but this is so rare. Today, this encounter is regular. We can have this encounter across culture. You can travel to Asia tomorrow, etc. But that's the first, I think, moment when you have this kind of encounter of two different traditions. Alexander, the student of Aristotle, with the Indian philosophers. A very interesting moment. Yeah. So yeah, go
on. Another one from this one's from the UK. What's it like to be affiliated with the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies?
What's it like to be affiliated?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how to answer the question. What's it like to be affiliated? I mean, I've been teaching at Harvard for 14 years, and 8 of those years were full-time. And so I've been with the Rockefeller Center for a while. I think what's nice, not only the Rockefeller Center, but just being in this room with a group of interesting people, is you just have great dialogue and interesting back and forth. So I think that's the value of it, to place yourself in an environment where you're always being challenged and your thoughts are always being provoked. That's a wonderful thing, but that doesn't have to be only at the David Rockefeller Center. There are lots of spaces for that. So yeah, it's great. It's interesting when I teach students. I always, there's Richard Florida had that saying, the most important decision you make in life is the city you choose to live in. I don't know if that's the most important decision, but the idea that the places you choose to spend your time in, that's your big decision, because that's what's forming your character. So I think that's what's kind of nice, is if you have the freedom to make those choices, that's a wonderful thing. Yeah. Okay. I think here in Toronto, the best place to hang around is with Meta Spencer and the people who do the work she does.
What kinds of issues are you tackling when you're in this David Rockefeller place?
all the normal stuff of what's nice is the David Rockefeller Center, it pulls together intellectuals from around Latin America, and also intellectuals who aren't from Latin America but are studying Latin America. So then the dialogue you have about different things is really fantastic. But it's not different. It's different from any other center, of course, because it's Harvard and it has the resources to pull together amazing people. But I think you find that in lots of spaces, like right here in Toronto as well. So yeah, that's an interesting question. Thank you for that. Any other questions? Yeah.
Might it be possible to say anything about what kind of feedback you might have gotten from, let's say, as to this project, from like engineering students, and science students?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, of course, they're interested in it as a kind of secondary, as a kind of minor to their degree. What's interesting, though, is when you begin to talk to them about different theories of science, different conceptions of science. So, for example, how the ancient Chinese viewed science in contrast to, say, how the modern West approaches science. This to them is kind of interesting to begin to think about, to start to recognize that there are some assumptions within their field of study that they haven't examined. So I think they find that interesting. I mean, it opens up possibility for them. Every time you can give someone a question that forces them to challenge their basic assumptions, you're giving them an opportunity, right, to become a much more innovative, creative thinker. So people appreciate it. People appreciate that. Yeah, thanks for that. Any other questions?
Are you on social media at all?
No, I'm on Facebook. That's it. I haven't. There was a time a few years ago where I used to write once a week for Rabble. I used to write a column. So I think there's about 70 columns of mine online from Rabble. And I thought of getting back onto it, but I haven't for the last more recently. I haven't. Yeah. But thanks for asking that. That's a nice question. Yeah, and that actually encourages me to get back to writing regularly. Yeah.
I wonder if you talk a little bit about globalization, because we were originally thinking, let's have you give a talk about globalization. That is something you do.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what your take is on globalization.
Yeah.
There are all kinds of disputes about the desirability of different aspects of globalization, and I'm not sure how it connects with your interest in this Global Books project.
Yeah.
Do you see this as a form of globalization? Your effort to create a more cosmopolitan mentality.
Yeah, I do. What's interesting, globalization opens up a tremendous opportunity for cultural exchange, for the dialogue of cultures, of civilizations, for building a global civilization. So that's what excites me about globalization. But of course, the way it's been done so far has been, on one hand, we have much greater interconnection, of course, but on the other hand, massive increase in inequality. And also the feeling that globalization has been imposed on people, that experience of globalization is what's leading to the rebellion against globalization now, the various forms of rebellion. And Trump, in a way, is a kind of rebellion against globalization. Mm-hmm. So now my PhD research in terms of globalization was on the World Social Forum, which was focused, it was basically social movements, focused on thinking of ways of how do we reform globalization, how do we transform it. And so they came up with a number of interesting examples. And in general, the emphasis was on how do we make our society, our democracy more participatory? How do we create participatory democracy? Give people access to transforming society, not their representatives, but they themselves having a more direct role in transforming society. And of course, so their criticism of institutions like the IMF or the World Bank or the World Trade Organization is these institutions have tremendous power over us in terms of shaping our lives, but they're not elected. Why do they have so much power? They're not elected. We haven't chosen them. And of course, the argument then is, well, our representatives have chosen them. But our representatives, of course, when our representatives get together, they become a different force than from when they're simply our representatives. So I think my own take on globalization would be much more around how do we democratize it? How do we make it more consultative? How do we make it more participatory? And how do you extend that beyond the political into the economic and environmental as well, right? But that maybe I should save that for the conference. For your conference
but
later.
you say that this is you're referring to they. Who are they? For your PhD thesis, you were interviewing people?
Oh, I was interviewing social movements from around the world.
Social movements.
Yeah, various social movements around the world that defined themselves as global social movements. And they were trying to address the problems created by neoliberal globalization, by free market globalization. So
I can certainly say that what you're pointing out, the necessity of democratizing most of these institutions, global institutions, will be a very major part of what we're dealing with, because almost all of the great global risks that we're facing now require some adjustment along the lines that you're mentioning.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate about what you came up with out of all of your contacts with these social movements?
Well, okay, yeah. So first let me preface it, just to help with understanding this. Whenever a new political entity is being formed, right, like a nation or even a city, and in our case now, a globe where we can potentially all communicate with each other, a culture forms with it that creates a kind of commonality between all those diverse people, right? So for example, I mean, there are religious groups that are global. So they have a common set of texts, common rituals that unify them. So in our era of globalization, what is this common global culture? And what struck me is it's the worst possible global culture. It's consumer culture. What unifies us all around the world is advertisements, shopping. We have the desire for the American dream. And so I began to think, then I began to think about, well, what kind of culture would I like us to have as a global culture? And it seems to me a global culture that was based on respect for each other's religious, philosophical, cultural traditions is a much richer global culture, a different way of interacting with the other, right? Rather than interacting with them on the basis of clothing or shoes or whatever. So that's part of the reason that that's part of the reason I'm interested in this. Of course, I have my own interests. I'm just fascinated by philosophy and literature around the world. Okay, so that would be just to help you preface a bit of this. In terms of what I've learned, I mean, I just wrote a whole PhD on it, so there's a lot to say. But let me give you an example, an interesting example that might help. So the World Social Forum was this event back in 2001. Has anyone heard of the World Social Forum, by the way? Okay, you've heard of it. Good. So it's still remembered. It's amazing how quickly these things pass. But when it came out in 2001, the first World Social Forum, it was held in a city in the south of Brazil called Porto Alegre, which is a very interesting city. The reason it's interesting is since 1988, Porto Alegre has had a participatory budget. Everyone in the city can help construct the city's budget. So you have a city of 1 million people, and every year they do a 10-month budget process. 40,000 people help construct the city's budget. It's an amazing process. And so the city was chosen to be the site of the World Social Forum, the site of this gathering of social movements from around the world, because of this innovative participatory budget. And that's just an interesting example that most of us would never even imagine that. Couldn't we? Yeah, but in fact, if you think through it, yeah, we could do that, actually. We could do that here in Toronto. We could do that in many cities, it would be especially easy in smaller cities. So that would be an example of this idea of, can we take economics, which is usually the preserve of a kind of elite, and take it down to the public, explain it to the public, and have the public participate in constructing the economics. It's been very successful in Porto Alegre. Right? It's been very, very interesting and very, very successful in that city. Now, not in every city, but in Porto Alegre, it has worked. So I think this is like an example of a kind of viable, a real utopia that we can create, that we can use to pose against neoliberal globalization. But there might be a democratic globalization that would be even more effective. So, give me an example. Any other questions? Yes.
Do we need a new form of capitalism? And if so, what does that look like in your mind? Do we socialize it? Do we bring in externalities like the environment so that we don't run out of planet?
I have a feeling you know the answer to this better than I do.
I'm just wondering what's been explored in the classics and in these great books in terms of socioeconomics and what was successful in the past and that we could learn from.
Well, I mean, okay, we're in an interesting situation where economics have become more important than society. Right? This is a very interesting situation in world history. It's easier for most people to imagine the end of the world than it is for them to imagine the end of capitalism. That's a statement from Frederick Jameson, by a great theorist. And I think that tells us something. We're very locked into a certain way of thinking. And it's not simply out there. It's not simply, oh, there's a bunch of these, evil gnomes up in Switzerland who are plotting like world domination and et cetera. It's not simply something far out there. It's something right within us. We experience it in ourselves, just in our own various greeds and consumerism and so on. It's something that's very deep. It's biological. So to imagine a different type of capitalism to imagine an alternative capitalism is almost impossible right now. A different type of capitalism, there are different types of capitalism. Swedish capitalism is different from American capitalism. Chinese capitalism is different from American capitalism. Canadian capitalism, to some degree, is different from American capitalism. So there are some viable alternative types of capitalism. And we can see some countries are very successful in terms of environmental policy and so on, or much more successful. Say, like, for example, the Scandinavian countries, and others less. So I think we actually have quite a lot of models to look around and work with. What we don't have is a model that would act as an alternative to capitalism. I don't think we have at this time. Maybe we will in the future. I don't think we have a viable alternative. And you can even see this in Latin America with some of the Latin American leftists that came to power over the last 20 years. I think it was 12 countries in Latin America had leftist governments. And in all cases, essentially, what they asked for was a stronger state that would redistribute resources, tax more, redistribute resources from the wealthy to the rest of the population. So it wasn't an alternative to capitalism. It was just a kind of state interventionary, state intervention, a lot more state intervention than we've seen in the last 30 or 40 years, right? So I don't think right now we have a viable alternative to capitalism yet, but we do have alternative types of capitalism. Does that answer the question?
It does.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Hey, thanks so much. These have been great questions. I've learned a lot from this. I really appreciate these questions. Thank you so much.